I tell you, I will not forget our adage. The halls now lay perpetually dark, despite the lit lamps and candles. The faces of the ones passing through appeared twisted in madness, despite their carefree expressions. Such perceptions had now bothered Lawrence for some time. Occasionally, a fellow would pass with the same expression as him, the face of one that had seen past the veil. For every day he walked the halls of Bergenworth, he grew more into a stranger, becoming distant to his previous life. Due to his previous actions, he must move forward and away, that much was apparent, to become someone new, someone better. His knocking astutely portrayed his emotions, low and suppressed. There was no reply, not the usual gentle come in that he missed so. He entered despite his announcement having gone unanswered. Carol? He closed the door behind him. Only a candle burned at the table where the forlorn character sat. She was turned away from him and looked out through a window at the rainy weather, with one arm lying upon the windowsill. It struck him strange at first, seeing her with her hair freely laying down her back. It was much longer than he would have thought. She turned her head to look at him only for a brief moment, just to confirm, before returning her gaze to the outside scenery. Her eyes were red, and streaks of tears were still discernible in the short moment she looked upon him. None of them had by no means been as sociable as before, least of whom had been Carol. On the occasions she would be sighted, she always had the same signs of sorrow on her face. But being the caring Carol, she never wanted to bother anyone, so she hid it, alone. Carol. He hesitantly went over to her. She turned her head down so her blonde hair fell in front of her face. I wish to finally hear that you are all right. He knelt beside her so he could look up at her, into her sorrow-filled eyes. German and Maria are devastated. He meant a great deal to them as well. Out of all, they need it the most. To see you smile again. He would not blame her if she would say no, that she would never smile again. He would certainly have the same difficulty had he been in her stead, and Luna had been torn from his life. I miss him, Lawrence. A tear dropped down onto her lap. She drew breath but stopped herself from saying more, as if her words had gravely fatigued her. We miss you, Carol. Let us be there for you. She turned back towards the window and looked out at the rain. He noticed a piece of paper on the wooden surface, bearing a new of her special runes. A vertical line with a small dot in the center, which was surrounded by a half circle below it and one slightly smaller above, not fully meeting one another to form a whole. Hey, what does this one mean? She looked down at it, and for a moment it seemed to him as if she was about to smile. It helps someone. Oh, well, something I share my pain with. I can see him when I look at it, like he's in a dream somewhere, and it feels a little better. Once more her gaze turned towards the dripping pattern on the window, now with a little glimmer in her eyes. I don't think I can remain here, Lawrence. Everything feels so distant here. He placed his hand over hers that rested on her legs. I know what you mean. We all do. And maybe you're right. He stood up, lightly bringing the hand he held with him. Maybe our place is not here anymore. But we can still do what we came here to do. We still have each other. She looked up at him, not the slightest inspired by his words. I don't have him. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Lawrence admitted defeat. He tried, but he honestly had no clue what to say. He did not even know what to say to German. They all said very little to begin with, and it bothered and terrified him. But Carol might just have said the thing that summarized the cause of their gloomy state. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say. And I won't try to say something that I cannot support. But I will make sure we don't give up. Neither you or the rest. I do know the feeling of giving up. To quit all of this. But I for one can't allow myself. Not with all that I have seen. And I will drag you with me, whether you like it or not. He was caught by the smile springing forth on Carol's face. The only thing he truly needed from her, to be certain of what he ought to do. Luna, I need your help. Her back was disappearing down the long railing of the second floor. She turned to face him in the most bothersome fashion possible. Can it wait, Lawrence? I suffer from the worst headache. She muttered to him, touching at her temple. Come on, you can endure this one. Oh, you are in a good mood today. I have a plan. She rolled her eyes and exhaled while looking around. I need to sit down. She walked back up the steps and rocked over to a bench along the wall. I want to make a request to Willem about creating my own department, away from Bergenworth. Her eyes narrowed and brow frowned as she looked up at the ceiling, eyes closed. Have you... She suddenly leaned towards him and continued in a surreptitious manner. You still have that thing? I do. And he still doesn't know? He shook his head. She made a deep, disgruntled sigh before she leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Why are we still here? Do you know? Her eyes remained closed, like she had not even heard his question. We need to work. There are answers to be found, right? What I mean is, we can't very well quit. Whatever would we do with ourselves? She shook her head slightly. Independent studies. Sure to be a ball. Without changing her grimace, she turned to him and sighed. Very well. And what is your argument for Willem? I want to make a separate department dedicated to blood research. Surely he will see its logic. She looked away like the argument brought pain to her ears. But Lawrence, what does Willem care about the blood? You see how he is. He is barely... One eye opened and scanned for eavesdroppers before she leaned in closer with a lowered voice. He is barely himself. Would Willem we know send so many to continuously defile that hamlet? In light of his obsessions, he would disregard your request. And it's preposterous, but I'll convince him. Just look at what this work is doing to some of us. He disregarded her form of suppression and spoke louder and freer. Luna's face hardened, and the slightest tear began to form in her eyes. If all fail, I will ask him as a friend. She took his hand, her face filled with sympathy and care, which seemed to overpower her urge to weep. You have nothing to prove, Lawrence. Don't hurt yourself like this. You owe us nothing, and no one blames you for anything. You want to leave, I understand. So let's do so. But we do what we want, on our own accord. He looked into her large, mystical green eyes and attempted a counter-argument, but she was quick to hush him. I'll go with you to see him, but we do what is best for us, despite everything. Lawrence could understand what she meant, yet not entirely. A price had already been paid with nothing gained. He thought that perhaps he would be happy living another life, but not just like that. He thought that now when something had begun, that he had touched upon an ancient truth, he could not stop. And if he were to quit, he would be left to eternally wonder. So he looked into her large, mystical green eyes and clutched the hand holding his, happy to have her. With lighter steps they both made their way to the provost's office. His door stood closed. In a previous time, it had always stood slightly ajar. They knocked and entered without receiving an answer. Willem looked up at them, seated hunched over his desk with his face comically close to the table's surface. His mask was set aside on the table, and peering at them was the single open eye left on the provost's scarred face. He reached for it and slowly put it on before greeting them. What can I do for you two? He sounded very neutral. Once, it was an energetic and positive experience to enter his office, always greeted by the enthusiastic provost. Now it seemed his mind kept him ever occupied, and had little time for trivialities from the rest of the world. I had this idea just now, one that perhaps could increase efficiency around here. He stared into the half-spheres, covering the eyes on the provost, and for a time it was silent. Willem took his time to look at him, then leaned back in his chair. Oh? It was dark inside, the only light being that of the lamp that illuminated the obscure work of the provost. I would see a new department open up where we can research the old blood more thoroughly. I, of course, would take responsibility for such a facility. Willem's head remained unmoving for a long time, making his thoughts hard to discern. I see. He folded up his fingers and began tapping his thumbs against each other. I thought we had begun to understand one another. Lawrence sighed discreetly. I understand. The old blood is dangerous. But isn't everything that we do steeped in some risk? True enough. But this is not about research and pursuit of knowledge. The old blood is only for you to pursue, yours to discover. You have decided and won't yield, it seems. Lawrence sighed a second time, more audible. You have it wrong, Master Willem. You cannot accuse me of such, and you continue to dance around my reasoning. How can we so easily disregard something we know so little about? He stopped, tapping with his thumbs, and gripped the armrest. That curiosity of yours will be your undoing, Lawrence. Mark my words. I am not saying so out of spite. I am advising you. Your mind is too occupied by the blood. It is the thing that drives you, not a means to an end, like it ought to be. When will you see that the blood holds no more answers? His breath escaped him. Willem's stern tone had regrettably made an effect. Fear the old blood, he replied weakly. Luna stepped forth to lean with one hand on the desk.
Look, Master Willem, I agree with Lawrence on this one. We have observed incredible indications that the blood possesses great restorative capabilities. Seems to me you too have made up your mind. What's with this opinion, really? Do you know something that we don't?
Willem remained unflinching in temper, despite Luna's near-mocking accusation. The material realm can sometimes obscure the truth of things. But I could be as inquisitive about you two, having been somewhat quiet about this topic, and what you found at the hamlet. You suddenly come to me with a plan to establish a surprisingly prominent place of research. Do you not think this chat appears equally strange to my ears as yours?
I wouldn't put it past you, Master Willem. But was it not you that insisted on letting our minds wander, to pursue that which our instincts told us to be worth pursuing? To follow our inner eye?
The side of Willem's mouth twitched slightly. Fear the old blood. This is not a field that abides the worldly laws as we know them. Continuing with direct research into the Great One's nature is the safer alternative. Safer? Lawrence furiously interjected, having lost his composure in a flash. An alternative that had us desecrate men and women's heads? then I would much rather throw my lot with a fearful old blood. He stormed out, leaving the two to continue the painful argument. He did not care that his reaction appeared juvenile. The thought of how Willem had sent more scholars to further search and slay the whalers made it all unbearable. To be the one to first commit the atrocity, then become aware that those around him had willingly continued them. It made everything seem dark around him. A world of madness. He would no longer enforce Willem's alternative. Like Luna said, they do what they wish on their own accord. German had searched in all the obvious places, such as her dorm, the training ground, his workshop, even throwing scattered looks around the lecture hall. None were the wiser to her presence either, and could give no answer when he questioned. When he went to the lunarium, it was not there he found her, but spotted her from a distance. With a view of the lake and its surrounding forested coast, he could discern a familiar figure along the water's edge. The trees stood close, and no proper path led to her position. None had been able to find her, save for his own eagle eye from that specific angle. With her back to the forest, eyes out towards the Grand Lake, she sat on a fallen tree right by the water. Had she chosen to do so, she could have submerged her feet into the shallow water, but had them resting on a rock jutting above the surface. Maria. She looked back at him. Her face was foreign to him, unreadable to the degree it could very well be a whole other person's. May I sit?
Mm-hmm.
He stepped over the log, but found it awkward to place his feet. Eventually he would find a straining resting place for them, after some shuffling around. It's nice here.
Mm-hmm.
So, when did you plan to come back? Do you even sleep back in your dorm? He spoke in a precariously cheery tone. Her face was unchanged.
I don't know what to do with myself, German. I don't know where to go.
You plan on leaving?
No.
He did not quite know what more to say, so he said nothing for a while.
How are the others doing?
She eventually asked with a slight quiver in her voice, but to his knowledge, it was vague enough to be anything. Like you'd expect, they are not themselves.
How about you?
Life must go on.
It must. Just like that.
No, it is by no means simple. But what can I do?
You are not sitting here every day.
No, I'm not. I try to keep busy.
Does sound simple.
You should try it. He smiled, but she did not. eyes still fixed out over the water. Ever since he sat down, she had never taken her eyes from the distant horizon.
How could I?
I'm here, Maria. Whatever you need. Her gaze wandered down along the water until the sides of her hair obscured his sight of her eyes.
Curses. Those that died. I do mourn them. But what I did.
You mean... what was it?
The vile art of Cainhurst. And I fell for it. That's what I mean. Don't you see? I let it happen.
You cannot... He wanted to take all of her blame away from her, but realized that his words could not. She shook her head.
Don't you feel like a fool? I'm not accusing you, but I surely feel like one.
For not knowing Willem's intentions.
That and more. I don't know how to explain it.
She buried her face in her hands.
The thing is, German, that we all want something. Largely it is the same thing. But lately I have seen that everyone wants that thing more than life itself. The truth, or whatever you want to call it. You know what I speak of. Back there, I really saw it. That everyone, including myself, wants the truth so much that the world around them stops to make sense. And the things you do when nothing makes sense. Well, you saw it too.
Then, have you reconsidered what you want?
Like I said, it is not that simple. What do you want, German?
To know the truth, but... He looked upon her frail, hunched form. In his silence, she looked up at him, and their eyes met. I only want to feel closer to it. To feel that everlasting mercy. Know it and not just sense it in fleeting moments.
What would you give to have it then?
It is a search, a hunt, and it takes time. I will make mistakes along the way, and you will too, in whatever you search for. She turned her head back outward. She had never appeared more distant to him. Despite it, she leaned over to rest her head on his shoulder. He stretched out his legs to lay beside her on the rock.
Time.
how's Maria? I heard she went home.
No. She would not return there. She just keeps to herself. Her family has an estate in town. I meet her sometimes, but I can tell she needs to be alone.
German was lost to the scenery outside the carriage window.
But I think she's going to like this.
Lawrence turned towards Vitus, sitting next to German and also with his eyes fixed on the outside. I hope it will benefit us all. I thank you sincerely, Vitus, for doing us this favor.
Don't speak of it. I fully intend to take advantage of this opportunity myself. I prefer working with German than potentially deal with another Hamlet. I have no problem with jumping on your boat, Lawrence, seeing how sanity is on board as well.
I understand. It seems we both have very little attachment to the institution. Vitus shifted in his seat.
We cannot keep sending them there, the lads. Every single one returns a different person. It is simply not the same Bergenworth anymore.
He suddenly had a little chuckle to himself.
I think of my old man, war veteran, fought bravely for the country and came home a different man. He would never approach the horses or step inside a carriage. Never fully knew why, but I can't help but feel I turned out much like him in light of things.
He did no longer appear as amused by the memory, gravely beholding the town outside as it passed them. With a foul mood now hanging over the three of them, Lawrence too turned his eyes outwards. It struck him that he had dearly missed the town, Yarnam. His younger years came to mind, playing in the streets, coming from a wealthy family, living in one of the pleasant parts of town. If he would be so fortunate, he would wish the relocation to be here, back to where there were only pleasantries and good people. Vitus fixed his attention at a certain view and banged with his fist on the carriage ceiling. They exited in silence and found themselves in front of a 3-story house, in emergence with many others lining the street's facade. The line of abodes were each decorated finely with expertly made masonry. The wealth of each inhabitant was apparent by the different displays of ornaments and patterns on their house exterior. The entrance they now stood in front of appeared nearly as a little house of its own, protruding from the facade. On both its sides stood 2 towers, halfly built into the exterior. Many of the finer buildings appeared almost as small squaric castles, with many adorning spires on the windows. Vitus quickly exchanged a word with the coachman before approaching the door. He disregarded the tiny door knocker and started banging straight on the wood.
"It's Vitus,"
he yelled and waited for the host's arrival, ceasing further abuse on the door. As Lawrence understood it, Vitus had done business of some kind in the past with the man. Of what kind was never explained, and now he was apparently owed a favor. He could only hope, in light of Vitus' background, that the matter had been compliant with the law. The door swung open by a tall, older gentleman with thick glasses and goatee. Lawrence and German ascended the marble steps, and stood behind Vitus.
Dear God, at this time of day? In with you, quickly!
The man stepped out of their way for them to hurriedly cramp themselves through the entrance.
Sorry about that. It was urgent.
Vitus explained with a shrug, not at all bothered by the host's displeasure. The door was closed and the man grunted.
If only you could be a bit more subtle at times.
When he took the time to examine his associate's entourage, his temper calmed a bit. The sight of Lauren's naturally sharp appearance must have brought a more familiar tone around.
Well then, pardon me.
He extended his hand to him.
My name is Mr. Bolton.
Lawrence.
Lawrence? Do you happen to study at Bergenworth?
A sense of conflict initially erupted within, never before having been recognized for his work. And there was a time when he would turn red by the occasion. Now, however, he felt at a loss. Yes, actually. But not so much of a student nowadays. He saw that both Vitus and German had stepped further inside over Mr. Bolton's shoulder. The host grew noticeably excited by the confirmation.
How marvelous! If my success in the house market had not been what it is, I would have pursued a similar path. I consider myself somewhat of a scholar too. But not, of course, to the degree as yourself.
Well, what a pleasant surprise. His wavering tone did not penetrate Bolton's enthusiasm, and he smiled joyously. He gestured for Lawrence to come inside before turning, shooting a quick glance at Vitus, then greeted German hastily with a brief handshake and an inaudible grunt.
This here is the new boss, you see.
Bolton smiled nervously. German remained stone-faced.
A pleasure. I can't begin to imagine your prowess and skill to lead those expeditions. I am, humbled.
German's left eyebrow twitched slightly. Otherwise, his face remained neutral.
You have a lovely home.
Bolton appeared almost surprised. He laughed it off quickly and gestured for them to follow him inside.
We have done many exploring jobs for Mr. Lawrence here, so I suppose he ought to explain why we are here.
Tea?
He asked, looking mostly at Lawrence. Yes, thank you. German held up his hand in polite rejection and Vitus shook his head shaggily. They entered a well-furnished parlor with many large plants taking up most space along the walls, with some tables and furnishing to support said plants. The right wall was covered with large windows, and within the same corner a table with surrounding armchairs stood. Bolton held up 2 fingers for a maid that peeked inside from a doorway on the left wall, nodded and disappeared back through it. He motioned for the armchairs, and he smilingly took a seat in the one next to where Lawrence sat himself. As you can imagine, the work at Bergenworth is plenty and very extensive. The project I have taken on as of late have grown in proportions. Simply put, we are amply equipped, but lack the space. So I am looking for an additional location where we can gather for efficiency's sake. Mr. Bolton nodded as if he was more familiar with the issue than he likely was.
Understand. How exciting.
The maid entered with a warm pot, 2 cups and a glass jar of herbs. He leaned forward in his chair at the arrival of the tea.
I oft attend open lectures at Bergenworth. As I said, your research is most fascinating. Do tell, is the research in question about the Sumerians? Their gods?
While Lawrence was preparing his beverage, he deliberately delayed the response. Religion could potentially be a sensitive subject in Yharnam, where the people held the gods dear. But since he pushed for the subject, he likely was not one of the sensitive ones. Well, I'm not really supposed to talk about it. But since you may have a role to play, let's just say you make the quite astute observations. An excited smile slipped out for a moment on Mr. Bolton's face.
Yes, quite good. How pleasing to know that progress is being made on such a daring matter. But personal interest aside, I'll be happy to help with finding just the right place for your important needs. Excuse me for a moment while I retrieve my property catalogue.
Managing to appear rather dignified, he was incredibly swift in exiting the room. German leaned towards Lawrence.
Calm down with the flatter. Don't say anything that can get you into trouble.
Hardly an issue. Besides, he adores the topic. He received a worrying look before Mr. Bolton came back. He opened up a bound folder with a heap of papers.
I have some affordable objects in mind regarding your preferences.
Very good, Sir Bolton.
Vitus leaned forward.
But do not forget, I have a favor to spend.
Mr. Bolton aimed an irritated grimace towards him, but complied and began to search the documents.
Does it need to be central?
No, preferably not.
Spacious?
Please. He nodded and soon had made a compilation from the bundled selection. A paper he gave to Lawrence, another he folded out to reveal a blueprint.
This is the largest object I have for sale at the moment. An old chapel. I imagine it would fit very nicely. Very open and amply spaced. Not very furnished, but it is in agreeable condition structurally. Old Yharnam, that is.
German leaned closer to be part of the examination.
A fickle property to find a buyer for. I believe the clergy relocated and left the thing. But it is the most spacious and might ironically serve a grand purpose once more.
What else is available? He began showing other blueprints, but it was quickly determined that due to their size or layout, the church was superior. What do you say, German? Lawrence glanced over to his friend.
Well, I like it. But I'd say it's not entirely our choice alone to make.
Lawrence? Excuse me, Lawrence? He called out down the hall, and the man in question turned, searching his memory a short time before seemingly finding the recollection of who he was. Oh, yes. Garreg, right? Yeah, right. So, Lawrence looked at him wonderingly. His well-kept hair now longer and sloppily tied behind his head, dark circles around his brown eyes. He knew him to be of a sharp expression and appearance, always near to a curious smile, but now was visibly tired and drained.
I was
He sighed and found it harder than he had initially thought.
Yes? All right. I understand you have asked Seamus to work on a project.
Lawrence nodded faintly.
That is not to be around, right?
Some characters walked past further down the hall. Lawrence tilted his head towards a door that he opened swiftly and relocated into an empty study hall. That is correct. Did Seamus tell you?
Yes. He thought I should ask you, well, to be part of it.
Mm-hmm. Why?
He told me that you have, I have also been there. The Hamlet.
Without moving his eyes, Lawrence's gaze ceased to look at him, but through him. A blanket of recollection had rolled over them, and he was somewhere else. Some place that gripped hold of his faculties strongly.
It was not long ago. I actually just quit on the research team. Could not stomach it.
He stood silently and waited for Lawrence nervously, while the past seemed to have captured him for a longer duration. What did you do? He finally said stiffly.
It was something else. We were to gather specimens and evaluate them. You know, I worked in the labyrinth, in interpretations. Many strange things happened, and when it became dangerous just to read the texts, I stopped. Began employing my skill elsewhere. At first, I took it as a good sign, you know? Starting fresh, maybe. But then I came to the Hamlet and...
He glanced at Lawrence, feeling like he might had rambled a bit, but he nodded patiently with him.
I don't think you find knowledge by committing depravities, Lawrence. That is what we are doing. I know if I continue doing it, it will surely destroy me, or make me into something else entire, as it already has to some of my friends down in the labyrinth.
I see. I was there too, the first time. You are lucky not to have been there then, but your experience is still horrifying. I know it well. He examined him once again, lingering on his face as if searching for something specific. We will be working with the old blood. I have started moving and purchasing some things to be sent to an old church. If you indeed are like me, tired of this work, but not willing to yield the ambition, there is room for more. Lawrence stepped out from the carriage where he had offloaded the last of his belongings. Luna came around from behind the gate, having exited the main building of Bergenworth. Judging by her distraught demeanor, the farewell had not been as intended, and he began to dread his own last meeting. He knew she was not as tempered as he was when it came to sensitive situations.
Not one word.
She hissed as she blew past into the carriage. He left her be, focusing instead on his own form of departure. He began approaching the gate, walking past the carriages. Outside one stood German, wordlessly following his steps with his eyes. Under his guard stood a melancholy Maria, gaze unfocused. He was aware of her sleepless nights, induced by nightmares. He had never been properly there for her during her hardship. But he knew German was, and he knew that was enough. Having second thoughts? It was admittedly a rather daring comment in light of her probably not being in the right mood. She did not look at him, but smiled faintly. The other teachers and associates had been understanding of his choice. It was not too strange, having a young scholar leave after a while to pursue his own ambitions. And it suited him that the rest believed that to be the sole reason. But this last encounter had been eating away at him. Willem had not understood, and would never listen. He had changed so much since then, and he would not have any other methods interfere with his ambition. Perhaps he did know something that Lawrence did not, something that Lawrence did not understand. But that notion felt misplaced, and this decision felt right. And so, one is left only with the inner voice as guide. He walked around the left corner of the gate and into the main building. Willem sat in his rocking chair, faced away from him. He was clad in his long blue robe, which he lately adopted as his normal wear, and would usually appear in it, making him look more like a preacher than a prestigious scholar.
Master Willem, I've come to bid you farewell.
He took a few steps towards him, into the dim candlelit room. Willem was unmoved, tapping his long golden staff into his other hand.
Oh, I know. You think now to betray me.
No, but you will never listen. I tell you I will not forget our adage. He walked closer as Willem began, the old saying that Lawrence did keep at heart all this time, despite the suspicion that the provost believed him insincere.
We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Our eyes are yet to open.
As Lawrence arrived at his master's side, they finished the adage in unison.
Fear the old blood.
I must take my leave. He turned and left the provost alone. When he had closed the door behind him, he could discern Willem saying to himself from inside,
By the gods, fear it, Lawrence.
With nervous anticipation, Lawrence waited to observe the others' first impression as they stood inside the vacant church. With Luna he could plainly see how she ran countless furnishing scenarios inside her head, eyes darting over the bleak in terror. He took her hand, and without looking back at him, she nodded. Carol was harder to interpret. Her empty, bright eyes examined the surroundings, causing her no visible distress nor joy. At least she appeared occupied enough to have forgotten her sorrows, if only for the moment. Turning towards his left where German and Maria stood, he saw them both smile gently. It occurred to him that he had not seen them like that for the longest time. He had previously admired with astonishment how German had kept himself so composed, but seeing as he was now, how his shoulders slumped and eyelids being heavy, he saw how, despite appearances, he was no different from the rest of them. The things they all brought back from the hamlet, and now, here, he saw the smile of a man who had laid his burdens down at his feet, finally feeling respite. But in short, his eyes regained their vigor.
Well, no point standing around.
He turned and headed back towards the yard. Before he could do so, Lawrence hurried to step in front of him. Why don't you take a moment? I and the others can handle it. Take a peek around, why don't you? His head looked back upon hearing Maria taking the first step deeper into the large space. She twirled around and looked expectantly at him. Come, German. Her face was cold, as well as her voice, akin to the mannerism of a doll. He closed his eyes as if falling into slumber, and followed after her. As it was, many of them had been forced into lodging within the church for a time being, while procuring other estates. The provisional living arrangement got him thinking about the various motives of his companions. Those of his scholarly peers he thought to grasp perfectly well, relating more personally with them due to idealism and methodology that did not fit in at Bergenworth. But regarding the protectors, whose invaluable assistance would continue to supply them with relics from the labyrinth, their motives were more obscure to him. While the situation did not appear to strike them as bothersome, he still found himself wondering why remain. All were there because of doubt, reluctance in Willem's ways. It was obvious why the intellectuals lingered, but what of the protectors? Surely there was other work to be found, even for German. Yet here they were, still at the back of their master. He walked back outside, through the large arching door. Some of the equipment they brought had been purchased anew, some had been donated, likely without the provost's involvement. It had been Master Valar who, in the last seconds, had approached with the request to take some old equipment off his hands. Thinking they needed whatever they could get, he agreed but had found the supplies to be of a much more generous quality. It was a source of regret for his decision, but only a small one.
Here, Lawrence.
The young protector George appeared behind him as he was about to remove a large coffer from the loaded carriage.
Let me lend a hand.
He nimbly and casually jumped inside, stepping lightly between the luggage and grabbing the handle on the other side.
Oh, thanks, George.
They lifted it outside and walked back towards the amassing heap growing inside by the church door. It was a slight point of envy seeing German's lads running to and fro, carrying luggage with skill and care. Judging how the coffer felt in his own two hands, George's ability to effortlessly carry it with a single hand further played on the same envy. They gently placed it on the floor inside. Before George left for another hall, he felt a curious need. George, could I ask you something? The youthful man gave pause and leaned back against the pillar. Depends, but go ahead. Apologies for the bluntness, and you needn't answer. But how do you regard the fishing hamlet incident? The reason I suspect has us all here now. His relaxed expression vanished, and Lawrence regretted ever posing the question. Well, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there, so it's probably worse for you. That may be true, of course, but here you are. I mean to say, is this what you truly want? Following a group of poor scholars? George looked away, towards where German and Maria stood, and his eyes lingered there. I get you. And if I too should be blunt. He looked back at him, flashing a big grin. I'm still here for the training. Not done yet, you see. Right. Well, just so you know, there won't be much of a pay anytime soon. The smile on his face persisted, and he walked up to dunk Lawrence on his shoulder. Come on, there's still plenty of luggage to go around. He walked out through the church door, taking with him some of that feeling that had burdened Lawrence. Accursed brew. Skull of a local from the violated fishing village. The inside of the skull was forcibly searched for eyes, as evidenced by innumerable scratches and indentations. No wonder the skull became stewed in curses. They who offer baneful chants weep with them as one in trance.